How should companies approach innovation to stay ahead, solve sustainability challenges, and create new opportunities? Join us as we discuss this topic and some of the practical frameworks to achieve innovation.
Innovation has a direction. It's not just a scattered random gun approach. There's a lot that we can improve and do better when we think about it in these kinds of with these types of considerations.
Thanks for joining me on the show today. And I thought we could kickstart with a favorite topic of yours, which is innovation. You've been an innovation advisor to United Nations for quite a while, and you've done a lot of work in that space in the last 15 years. It would be nice to start with, the current state of innovation. Where are we today on innovation? I remember watching one of your videos and you talked about the innovation we need right now is here. So it would be nice to just hear where we are today on innovation.
Sure, and thanks so much. Maybe just to set the context, right? So innovation can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. In some places around the world, they're actually doing quite a lot of innovative work, but not necessarily calling it innovation. And of course, all the way to government to private sector, there's all kinds of efforts to really change things. And innovation in some cases is really a sandbox for trying new practices, building new products, services, etc. In a way that you're expecting to try something really radically different. There's also incremental innovation. There's ways that you can just literally be making a minor modification, but that changes the game, right? So an example of that would be in the past, decade or so, you're looking at fintechs, right? So this is an example of innovation in the private sector, but ultimately changing legacy systems by putting different types of new tools, new stacks, technology stacks together. But the kind of innovation that I've been mostly focused on, as you mentioned, in the past 10 to 15 years, is really also around understanding and codifying innovation that has a lens that is also considering the less usual suspects, which actually is most of the world, which is everyday innovators, those that are doing innovation, in communities at a local level, all the way up to those that might be trying something quite different from a corporate point of view. And maybe I'll just mention part of my work in the past 5 years is we with two others co-authored a book on inclusive innovation. And this was really an attempt to kind of do meta research around what do we really mean by innovation? Are there other narratives beyond the ones that we typically think of when we think around, when I say we, I would say mainstream narrative often goes straight to Silicon Valley and thinks of that as the model and the archetype of innovation. But, as we did our research and also as we discovered, there's a whole spectrum and different stories of innovation that go all way back, hundreds of years, of course. But it's also interesting in the collective imagination what innovation triggers in someone's mindset. So my lens has mostly been looking at it from a different point of view, but also with the lens of thinking around the ecological aspect. Not just tech, not just the human centered version, but also one that really considers the planet, the climate, and ecology. So we can get into that too, maybe later if you want. But that's a little bit of the let's say setting the scene, so to speak.
Yeah. In terms of the green transition, so let's talk about the green transition and perhaps focus the innovation on that space. What are the challenges that we see with innovation today?
Well, yeah, I mean, if we ask this question, right now we are in Q2 2025. You ask this question 2 years ago, 1 year ago, or even maybe a year from now, and the answer is always going to be changing because the world is changing very, very quickly, especially from a geopolitical point of view. So when we talk about the green transition, what do we mean by that? In many ways, just the shortcut way of thinking of it is really about transferring from, an industrial economy that's basically been running mostly on fossil fuels to one that can be also, decarbonized or using renewables. But long story short, transitioning so that there is, new industry that does not generates, the aftermath of what's is often considered, or science would tell us, is generating a lot of greenhouse gases. So, in if you really double click on it, you hear the green transition all the time, and again, this can also mean many things to many different people, and it also invites um, some of the challenges that come around greenwashing. There's a lot of different ways that green transition can be used in a narrative point or format. To impact the ways that certain types of economies or services are positioned or framed, and it's been quite, as I'm sure quite politicized, and that's why I was mentioning when we bring this up, it really is going to be a place of debates, depending on where in the world you are and what room you're sitting in with whomever, because there's a lot of different opinions around whether or not this is something that needs to happen or when it should happen. And as we know, and maybe we'll talk about the ESG shifts that are happening in terms of investors, having possibly a little bit more of a backlash behind it, because the green transition, often in the most, let's say, the past 5 years, especially, a lot of public sector incentives have been there. So governments have been, in some cases, incentivizing switching to more, let's say, a decarbonized approach to industry. So that would mean very specifically, in some cases, solar being incentivized, wind generation, things like that. So this is something that has. It sounds really simple. I mean, it can, but the complexity around the debate and the conversations, it's endless, and, but at the same time, we're in a very different moment now than even, 10 years ago, because 10 years ago, the cost of actually using alternative energy that's not necessarily anchored on, fossil fuels was quite expensive, and now it's at scale to where it's actually, in many cases, the best alternative from an economics point of view as well.
I wanted to ask about, the starting point of innovation. Because I was discussing earlier, and in terms of what's happening in this ESG sustainability world, as you mentioned and alluded to, it's been politicized, and the question is this the right moment to then focus on the real impact of innovation? So what we've seen is, a lot of companies started with the low hanging fruits. A lot of companies so focused on reporting, and a lot hasn't been done in terms of research. Of course, some of the big companies are doing that, but a lot of companies haven't done so much in terms of, you know, seeing it as an opportunity. It's been more, what are the low hanging fruits? What are the quick tick boxes? So the question is, what is the starting point for innovation? And what would you be saying to companies to do differently?
Well, great question. And I think, ESG is a framework for tracking, using metrics to track and report on environmental, social, and governance. Right. So you would have a composite score, so to speak. And then this is theoretically a way to signal, to the world, to investors, the types of things that you're doing, positively speaking. Um, and really, it's large companies that have the resources to get into that level of minutia and detail to track and build those reports, because a lot of these types of reporting, is much more complicated and difficult from a resourcing point of view if you're a small to medium sized business. So I would start by saying it also depends on what scale and what size and context, right? The company is approaching innovation. And, what I find quite interesting, despite, whether or not, there's the ESG is a trend that's going to continue, or maybe it's going to evolve into a different set of standards, etc. What I find very interesting when I talk to large scale private sector companies, particularly that have a materials, anchor to their supply chain. So, because some large companies, it's digital, for example. Um, but when you thinking about those, for example, in, let's say, food and agriculture, large scale companies that need to source, and they know that touches, farmers, meaning there's a social element to be considering, not just in your own company, but when you're thinking around the different scopes of where your impact is. So you have that social element. Of course, food and ag is very much connected to climate and environments. So there's all kinds of ways that there's metrics to be measured. And then I'm maybe less emphasizing governance here for the innovation angle. But, doing business the right way is to secure and, let's say, future proof, not to over use a word that's kind of, again, maybe sometimes a very commercial way of putting things. It's just smart business. Whether or not they're doing ESG, there's many companies that I've been interacting with in the past half year even, they're still very much going to do the right things right, and that's what their intent is, despite um, whether or not there's the pressure from the ESG side. So when it comes down to innovation, what I'm noticing is there's a lot of um, different ways of thinking around financing. So even there's innovative finance, but there's also on the material side different ways of securing your supply chain so that it can be more sustainable, because consumers do there is that demand in many cases. Consumers do want to source from those that they know are also, not having, children in child labor in the supply chain, is not in a sourcing food, so to speak, or, from areas that are deforested because of that. So these are the kinds of things that, again, companies that are large enough to even do ESG tracking and metrics, create their own dashboards, authentically want to be working in a very innovative way, so that it is, the impact is there, and that it's also, financially strategic as well. So you're doing things in a way that's going to make the costs of doing business affordable. So your question was really, a broad one, so I was trying to give some, precise examples, but also some considerations, like when we do think around, innovation. Again, like, what's the specific application of it? It's endless, and I find it to be also really exciting to see companies, in the private sector, in particular, step up and do things, well and right, despite what's the next trend or pressure, so to speak, coming from investors or government.
You know what, Courtney, I like the way you put innovation, which is you can start something or you can just basically build on existing. And I'm thinking for SMEs. So for the large corporates, they have the resource. They set funds up, down. They have a and development department, but not a lot of them share that information because trade secret, whatever it is. So the question is for the SMEs, right? And for, just which is the bulk of the companies, a lot of companies are SMEs. It's just a few of them that are in that top 5% percentile. How can they innovate? And, the question for me is, how do they also ensure that they're not reinventing the wheel, that they can leverage off whatever is outside there already?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, SMEs around the world, again, it's always going to depend on context, but one of the key things is your hiring decisions. So, are you hiring, human resources and personnel that have that mindset in terms of really, the critical thinking and creativity to be able to, one, do a horizon scan? What else is happening, to answer your question around, you know, what other innovations are there? Let's not reinvent the wheel. That's half of the game if you're in an innovation role. And maybe you're not in an innovation role, but you can still have and bring forward that innovation point of view and perspective. It doesn't have to be in the title, so to speak. Um, And ultimately, it's about the kind of resourcefulness and the mindset that's being brought to the table. And so there's a lot of tools and frameworks that help this. And one of the ones that I find that I was exposed to over 10 years ago. And I think it initially originated out of a McKinsey tool, right? So McKinsey and Company had a tool and initiated it called the Three Horizons. And this framework, what I'm noticing, people are using in so many different ways and contexts. I use it all the time in my work in different formats. But long story short, it really helps you think around, okay, the three horizons of your business. What's the first horizon being your core business, your day to day, the things that let's say in the next 6 months, they're not going to change. You still need to ensure that your business model makes sense. You need to make sure that you're delivering on what it is that you're bringing to the marketplace, if we're talking about private sector in this sense or SMEs. But then the second horizon is what can you do that is, it's a scaffold towards the next 18 months that would be very much thinking around future scenarios. What are the trends? What are your competitors doing? What do you want to do differently? And again, there's more nuance to it all, but just in, the general sense, I'm trying to explain the framework. And then the third one is kind of like the moonshots, where might you have the opportunity to leapfrog? To be able to then think around how you're allocating time on a weekly and monthly basis to investing in each of those horizons is really the key, right, for change. Because otherwise we get stuck in the day to day, you know? So you have to prioritize where you're going to do the R&D, research and development, for the other things that are coming in the future. And, an example, very, I think, prescient would be maybe you just really trying to get your whole team really used to using, let's say, AI in this case, like how can your team become a learning team, your company, where you're actually, better understanding the markets because you're able to, the core part of your personnel really gets how to leverage technology that's there today that wasn't there 2 years ago. I mean, we're seeing this also even in our team. I mean, everyone's talking about AI, but to be able to really leverage it and use it in a way that's, in the most simple sense, actually applied every single day in your teams and the work that you're doing. That's a new behavior, right? That's a new behavior and skill set that needs to be integrated and upgraded. And so these are the examples. This is what I mean when I say the mindset of constantly learning, sense making, reflecting, and then also being able to kind of bring the team, right? There's a leadership capacity piece here too. So you really also need to ensure that everyone's kind of moving in the same direction together. And that's where these tools and frameworks actually are really, really helpful from a strategic point of view to guide a team to make sure you're on the same page at the same time, working with the similar focus, right? So this is an example that I don't know, I think is what I'm noticing as well, right? It's like everything's changing. So the learning component, the mindset is super critical to trying to do anything different.
Sure. Before I ask the main question, I'm just curious about who is the ideal team for innovation. For a company that can't afford to hire an innovation specialist, how should they constitute their team?
Yeah, I mean, this is the I suppose anyone listening or those with enough work experience, we probably, when you ask that kind of question, you can probably pull out a whole set of examples of teams that you loved being a part of and teams that you couldn't wait to say bye to, right? So it's really interesting. I mean, at the end of the day, you can have the most brilliant minds, but if they don't work together, if there's not really a sense of collaboration and safety and flow, and there's toxicity and frictions that come from personalities, then that's going to stifle things for sure, because you really have to have in my opinion. I mean, now we're talking about the soft skills, right, around teams, but it's honestly it's like step zero if you want to be building a team that's going to generate really resilient and interesting new ways of doing things internally. Maybe it's from the operational point of view, or maybe it's externally in terms of what the company is offering. Um, it's kind of fascinating because it's the software, right? It's the human side of things. When I say software, I mean it's not like the all the cool tools and technical things that, and even money that you could throw at an R&D unit. It's really about the people, and so making sure that culture of who you're bringing together. If you're the decision maker, hiring, that's the first basic step to it all, actually.
Okay. Now, I don't know if I'm asking the obvious because you did mention AI, but before the trend of AI, are there repositories or database where companies can tap from in terms of existing innovation?
So, yeah, of course. I think it depends on the industry, the sector, what you're looking for. One of my previous roles, I was actually called head of exploration. This is with the UNDP in Asia Pacific. And a lot of my work was really, it was about horizon scanning. What I mean by that is it's literally trying to, in many cases, as quick as possible, really understand if you have an issue, if you have a challenge, or something you're trying to explore, does it exist? Maybe it's something that has to do with circular economy in a certain kind of city, or a smart city thing here and there. How do you, do the research quickly to really understand what's being tested? And by the way, there's also a scale of on in terms of readiness, that's about a scale from 1 to 10, that's used to kind of identify, idea like in innovations that are emergent and they're at idea stage or prototype stage, to those that are already scaling or commercialized. And it's the TRL scale. And what you'll find is there's actually a lot of databases that do help you identify what kind of technology, like in the technology sphere, that you might be looking for, if it's tech in this case, and then better understand, who's been doing it, and what level of commercialization it's standing at. So a lot of these tech, let's say, innovations, industry ones in particular, some of them really started through government's programs, that were trying to do deep tech research and coming up with all kinds of interesting prototypes. And then some of that, of course, makes its way to the mainstream. And that's why we have the things that we can enjoy now when it comes to internet or cell phones. A lot of that didn't start necessarily just out of a random person or a company's basement. This was an industrial effort to accelerate some of these things. But just to say, yes, there are a lot of databases. I think it's getting more and more rich in terms of where you can find and access information. And now with AI being at everyone's fingertips, it really changes the game, because you can, with the right prompts, you can really find information so much faster than you could even 3 years ago or 5 years ago. Um, so yeah, this is just to say, it's there's always a research effort, and there's formal functions for some of these roles in which people do it. As I mentioned, head of exploration. This was the whole point of my role in that time, was to constantly try to see what's happening in the ecosystems and the landscapes that are relevant to the things that our teams were working on. But yeah, the databases exist. Um, does it mean that you're gonna find what you're looking for? And does it mean that if it's not on a database, it doesn't exist? No, not at all. In many cases, there's a lot of stealth mode things, right? So people are trying to build the next breakthrough technology, but they don't want everyone knowing about it until they have the right amount of investment or capital to bring it forward. So these are the also depends on the size and yeah, the age and scale of the company, right? Depending on what you're looking for.
Yeah. So Courtney, it would be nice to give like examples of websites where innovators or people that are curious about innovation can go to, so they don't have to reinvent the wheel.
Okay, fantastic. Well, one of my absolute favorites is by one of my friends that I met through a program in Amsterdam called the Think School of Creative Leadership. And he's a futurist, and he's created a company called envisioning.io, and it is really able to it has a whole database that also scrapes the web as well, but also is informed by um, people on his network specifically. But it's looking at different signals, different trends, but then actually mapping out um, the hardware and software innovations that are there, right? And as I mentioned before, there's also a tagging, so you know if it's something that's just in prototype phase or if it's something that's literally about to be commercialized and scaled. This one, to me, is one of the best that I've seen, and what it makes it even better is that it's constantly evolving, which means, I mean, our world is constantly changing. So how do you map all the things that are going on all the time? So this one is quite cool because you can find the domain, the sector, the innovation, and double click, double click, and you find yourself discovering more. And relevant for the work that I do, there's also mapping around things that have SDGs, so Sustainable Development Goals as well is also nice to see where someone has thought through uh, where this technology fits into basically contributing to the world or the SDGs.
Thanks for that. Now, what is the case for innovation in sustainability, transition? What is the case, especially given the fact that you have also led some innovation projects from the C3 Labs? It would be nice to talk about your success story and why every company should consider innovation, especially as a leverage for sustainability.
Well, yeah, I think, I mean, another way of looking at it is, you can't afford not to do innovation. The status quo is yesterday's news, So it's a constantly changing, rules of the game kind of situation globally, as we're discussing, right, with geopolitics and with the times that we're in. And so, yeah, there's to me, it's one of the most interesting things because right now one of the projects that I'm working on, I'm co-leading, we're calling it the C3 Labs. It's collaboration for complex challenges. So first time we're going to be, I mean, in the pilots, right? So piloting is another example of testing out innovation. So we'll be launching in Kenya and Thailand and a global lab as well, focusing on the complexity at the nexus, the heart of the climate, biodiversity, and food systems area. So the challenges that are at these intersections is what we'll be focusing on in those country contexts. And really, we're looking at kind of two, I guess you could say, flying at two levels of altitude. One is around deep collaboration. So I mentioned earlier, honestly, not much is going to work super well, super right, unless you've got the right team or the right people with the right mindsets. And what I mean by that is people that are comfortable working in with unknowns, working with emergence, working a little bit. It's very cliche to say, but outside of the box, and that's part of what they're bringing to the table. So we're testing out methodologies and codifying them around deep collaboration. So what's the human side of how these things can move forward and generate? And then we're looking at the real serious challenges that we're talking around biodiversity loss or climates are impacting what was, previously very normal, say, agricultural land, and then there's droughts. So this is disruptive. So these are the kinds of examples of very real challenges happening on the ground that we want to bring people together to start building, portfolio of different innovative in interventions. Now, what's interesting is that we also chose not to really use the word innovation in our way we're talking about this, although it's a complete innovation initiative. um, we find sometimes the word can throw people, off, right? So it's kind of similar, like when you talk about love or God all around the world, people have very different associations. Like, what is God? What is love? These are innovations similar. It can mean a lot of different things, and it can also confuse people because it's not always clear the starting point of how someone is perceiving it. So we're doing an innovation project, but not calling it an innovation. We don't use the language of innovation. Actually, I don't even think once on our website or in our slide deck. Um, but that's ultimately, yeah, what we're doing. And the aim is also around how do we transform institutions that are, kind of out of date. And I'm not going to name names, but the point is, there's a lot of reasons why the status quo things stay stuck. And a lot of times it's because of old systems and just how things operate. Um, and so how do you shift things internally, right? So these are the questions that we'll be exploring in this new initiative we're in pre-launch mode, so we'll be launching soon. But it's one of the most exciting things that I'm lucky to be working on.
Great. Now, a question for you. With the private sector, is it better to work together and collaborate? Because I'm thinking of this project that you're working on. It might be funded by a couple of private sector investors, right? And that collective power of several players would mean that the project can be more impactful and it can scale faster than if individual companies were focusing on different things. So is there some advantage when private sector, when they come together, collaborate, and disrupt things together?
Yeah, I think this actually I have a very specific example that I cannot share the name of the company, but it's a large multinational. And what was so interesting is they're taking the risks of all of the things that we're just discussing around uh climate, biodiversity, and food. They're taking it very seriously, and they know that they need to work with their competitors to think about how to shift ways of business, right, when it comes down to sourcing in the supply chain. So, I thought it was fascinating to just talk with them, and learn that actually they get it, they know that they have to be working at the whole system, the whole ecosystem, so to speak, in the domain or the industry if they wanna safeguard, or mitigate the risks that are coming ahead in the future. So, that's a given, like, this does need to happen. The thing that's not a given is, this is multi-stakeholder work. This is complicated. There's a lot of politics. There's a lot of I mean, it doesn't have to be just private sector, but just saying when you're bringing together a diversity of players and actors, and in some cases competitors, um, this again goes right back to that heart of the question around who are the people, the mindset, and the personalities coming together. And a lot of times you'll go faster, further when you have, an aligned set of people, right? So, um, a lot of the work that we do, we also talk about systems change and systems transformation. Um, and yeah, we want to be working with systems aligned people that really understand how system dynamics work and understand that there's different parts of of the system to analyze and to then focus on or prioritize, shifting or impacting. So again, these are kind of the nuanced sides of like how do you get things done. Um, but more and more, that's also another interesting thing when we think around innovation. A lot of people are thinking around systems innovation, acknowledging that things do need to change. And there's some things, legacy systems that do get in the way at times, practices and systems.
And who is the best person positioned? So when I say person, it can be companies, it can be government. Who is the best position to facilitate that collaboration?
Well, yeah, really, again, it really depends. So, in many cases, not all the cases, but in some of the work that I've been doing with the United Nations Development Program (UNDP), we are actually invited or brought into a project or a process or a program because we have neutral, convening power, but the neutrality piece, right? So, we can create the safe space, so to speak. I use that term in quotes, but a place in which we can bring together, private sector, academia, governments, civil society in ways that's very difficult to do if you're on the other side of it. I mean, I've been a part of other initiatives where it's like community-based, grassroots, initiative for change. And if you want to bring in government, then they're not going to come if you're just a grassroots organization calling them up. It doesn't work that way, right? There's a lot of protocols around when and how government can engage. And this is not a blanket statement. It's just using my own experience to say that that was a really interesting, insight and learning. Um, But then intermediaries, right? So there's also another, if it's not the UN, which does always need to be, intermediaries. So those that are kind of organizations that are designed, again, with this perception and actual practice of neutrality or convening. That's usually a starting point, to minimize the perception that there's like uh, an alternative motive, so to speak, if you are happening to try to bring competitors together. In this example that you were mentioning.
I've always thought the innovation you focus on is largely on climate. But as you spoke, I love the way you reframed it to say it's on complex problems. So it can be climate today, it can be biodiversity tomorrow. Is that understanding correct?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I work across social innovation, systems innovation, climate innovation. You can do smart cities. It's endless, really. I
Yeah.
think the kind of common denominator is that you're really thinking around doing things differently, exploring what doesn't exist, wondering what could exist, um, and really looking for also edge innovations and edge innovators. So edge meaning, not mainstream. So things that are there, the famous quotes, "The future already, exists, but is not evenly distributed," along those lines. We have the technologies and the ideas that the world actually really does need. It just says it's like, how do you find in many cases, because we in kind of a mostly capitalistic, environment, how do you find the right market fit, because sometimes the business model for things that we need just doesn't the case hasn't yet been made enough. But these things are changing quickly. The same with social innovations. How do we do um, you know, community care in a different way? There's so many different really interesting ways to take innovation into the work that you're doing.
On a final note, let's talk about the approach to innovation. I know that you've co-authored a book on inclusive innovation. It would be nice to, explain more about that approach to innovation.
Right? Yeah. Maybe yeah, so we with myself and two others, my co-authors, we started this book as a inquiry into alternative narratives to Silicon Valley, right? So, in many cases, what we noticed, even governments globally around the world, trying to copy a Silicon Valley model to do things innovatively, and we said, wait, this is one, not always actually producing the right kind of outcomes because there's a lot of unintended consequences and harmful effects that the tech mentality and the approach that's coming from Silicon Valley has generated. So why are we rushing to copy? And two, there's a lot of cultural aspects to it. So does the Silicon Valley culture actually work in XYZ country? Because it's a different culture, that's the very essence. These are the intangibles that also need to be unpacked. So we wanted to also see, well, who else is doing what in different ways, and explore that. So in the book, we do have a lot of cases and examples of again, people doing very fascinating, powerful innovations in their daily work, but not necessarily calling it innovation, but that's actually they're doing things that meet a need, and doing it in a way that's resourceful, etc. But the other thing that we really bring forward, which I find you don't see it so much, maybe more and more here and there, but also considering the environment and nature, as part of the key consideration. So the point is, when we say innovation, but we say inclusive innovation, we mean having the including in your approach um, the social and the environmental aspects. Um, because if you're not thinking critically around what you're doing and how it impacts humanity and how it impacts the planet, then this is something that can be also quite dangerous. So innovation has a direction. It's not just a scattered random gun approach. There's a lot that we can improve and do better when we think about it in these kinds of with these types of considerations.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Courtney, for your time.
Thank you, Sammy.